Hi, I'm Karen Hawley Miles. I'm Executive Director and President of Education Resource Strategies. I hope that you'll learn about the key drivers of inequity in school districts and what role budgeting plays in that. And then that you'll learn some ways in which changing to a weighted student funding can help address that equity, but also the ways in which it can't, and in ways in which leaders need to do other things to ensure equity in the broad sense. It's one of the most critical things that we work on at Education Resource Strategies. We've worked for the last 2 decades really on supporting urban school systems in sort of becoming all that they can be. I'm very happy to talk with you all today, and I hope by the end of this presentation you will be able to define funding equity, that you will understand the typical drivers of funding inequity across schools and identify strategies to address them, and that you will understand how weighted student funding, which I'll define more clearly for you as I go on, can help address some of the drivers of inequity across schools. And you'll understand the ways in which it doesn't, and how important it is to think holistically about that. So the first thing I want to do then is start by defining equity. By equity, we mean something different than the same funding for every school and student. So what we mean is that students with similar needs get similar resources, regardless of which school they're in. So students who have greater learning needs, like special ed students or English language learners, or students that come into schools with very low levels of proficiency, get a greater level of resources to help them overcome those needs. And the second part of the equity equation is to make sure that schools with similar populations of students also get similar resources. You'll notice that we use the word similar or comparable because it's really impossible to get exactly the same amount of resources, and we'll talk a little bit about what is actually achievable. But to put some more concrete details behind that definition, I'll give you an example from a real district that we work with. So in this district, 2 schools, these are high schools, get approximately the same amount of money. It's just $100 difference if you calculate it on a per pupil basis. That means taking the total number of dollars they get to run the school and dividing it by the number of students there. And yet their population is very different. As you can see, School A has a much less needy population. Only 13% of them are special ed students, which is still a high number, as compared to student B, which is, school B, which is 24%. They have about the same number in resource rooms, which means that all of the rest of the special ed students are in the most expensive setting and are the students that have the greatest needs in school B. In addition, look at the difference between the percent of 9th graders that come into that school in the bottom quartile in English language arts. And then a very important metric that we use to give a sense of kind of the cohesion of maybe the neighborhood and the students that come into that school. Only about 1/3 of the students chose school B, whereas all of the students chose to be in school A. In addition, school A, with very much less need, has very different staffing and flexibility levels. In school A, the principal is known as a star, has been a principal for 20 years, and has complete flexibility over who he hires, the schedule, and how he organizes and groups students, and has handpicked his staff. In school B, this principal is a novice. He's got very little flexibility, and his teaching staff is assigned to them. Not only that, this school has 8 temporary teachers who are not certified in ELA, and you saw what a challenge English language arts was in this school. So given that, why should we be surprised that in school A, they were able to raise the percent of students that were proficient or advanced, whereas school B ends up having only 1/3 of those students being proficient or advanced? So this question of budget equity is really about creating a level playing field. But even as this example suggests, part of it is about money, and part of it is about the set of conditions and flexibility that surround what you can do with that money. And that's going to be a theme that goes through this all, because having the same dollars if you don't have the same ability to spend it in ways that you need, isn't actually contributing to equity. So this story of inequity is not at all unique. In every single district that we've worked with, we see wide variation in the spending on a per pupil basis across schools. And we're going to talk about the reasons for those. Not all of those are bad differences. But this chart here shows you the calculation of the dollars per pupil at each school in this district, sorted by what type of school it is, elementary, middle, and high school, and adjusted for the populations of students in those districts. So we've taken out the differences using a mathematical procedure that would be caused by one school having way more special ed students than another. So let's just focus on the bars on the far right at high school level, and you can see the spread on a per pupil basis, which is almost 2 times from the lowest to the highest district. So big differences in what these schools get. And when you translate that out, you multiply it out by the number of students in a district. This can be sometimes $200,000 and $300,000 differences across schools in total, enough of obviously to hire 3 or 4 teachers or to have coaches or to buy quite a bit of professional development time. So big differences in terms of spending. The districts don't mean to do this, and a lot of times this gets translated into some sort of conspiracy or something that people are deliberately trying to do. It's not something that's ever intentional, and it is a result of a series of policies and decisions that are made that kind of accumulate over time without people really looking closely at them or understanding them. We've analyzed this all across the country, and these 6 factors always account for most of the variations in funding across schools. Depending on your district, different things will contribute more to the variation or not. I'm going to go quickly through them and then focus really deeply on a couple that a lot of folks don't really fully understand. So the first reason that there are big differences in spending across schools is because school sizes vary a lot. I'll talk more about that in a second. The second big difference is by school type, and by school type we mean both grade configuration, elementary, middle, and high school, and schools have different staffing rules and funding strategies for those different levels, and also types of schools, like there might be specialty schools like art schools, or there might be magnet schools or so on that have different funding rules. The third reason is building utilization, which it correlates with school size, but it's not all about school size. So schools that get fewer students than expected or that aren't fully filled cost more to operate than other schools. The fourth big reason is differences in teacher comp. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. The fifth big reason is inaccurate enrollment projections, where the resources aren't adjusted to match them. And the sixth reason is in many districts, especially districts that don't actually do this looking across schools in a deliberate way, principals can argue for additional resources, and if they know the right people or they have a great reputation or they go to the right board member, they might get the additional program or the additional staff person to do what they need to do. Across the top, we look at the different drivers of the different decision makers or reasons for these factors. And what you can see is it's not all in the control of the central office to fix these differences, and that a lot of them are driven by union contracts and also by the configuration of your facilities in a district. So addressing some of these differences may or may not be feasible in the short term, and so it's a really important part of thinking about what true equity, not just financial equity, really is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's dive a little deeper into the school size drivers, because it's really important to understand this, and there's lots of ramifications, both for the funding system as well as for your facilities planning and school closures, which is a really hot topic right now. This chart, it just plots per pupil spending by school size. And so what you can see in this district, this is a chart that looks similar in almost every district. There are some things you could do to change the shape of that curve. But what you can see is the line goes exactly with school size. As you move in this district from a school that is less than 200, the cost per pupil goes down from $11,000 per pupil to just over $6,000 per pupil in a pretty straight line. So why is this happening? Well, the main reason this happens is because most districts allocate staff, not dollars, to schools. So you get one secretary, one principal, one guidance counselor, one librarian, one social worker if you happen to be richly funded per school. Some districts might give you a half of one of those positions if you're super small. But actually it's pretty much the rule that you get kind of one for these various things. And obviously if you do the math, you divide that by more students, the cost goes down. The second reason is, so some districts do step function allocation. So you might get an additional assistant principal if you get above a certain size, or 2 APs at another size. So this causes a certain chunkiness in the spending levels. Like if you're at the really low end of that trigger point, your cost would be higher than someone at the very high end of that trigger point, if you follow what I'm saying. The third reason that people don't really understand, and this has broader implications than just for funding, is the rounding up factor that happens with class size, actually. So especially in a small school, it's hard to manage the size of classes and the student-teacher ratios. And when you have very fixed cut points for class sizes, it makes this especially difficult. So let's say you had a small school with 2 classes in the first grade, and your class size target was 20, exactly fixed, and you had to stick with that as a contract. And let's say one year you get 44 first graders. So you add a third teacher, and what happens? The class size average goes way down. This happens more often the smaller the number of classes that you have in a grade. So it happens very often when you have only 1 or 2 classes in a grade. So you might be surprised to know that in many of the districts that you are working in, this is actually a key driver of extra spending. And one might argue that isn't this wonderful that the students in that particular grade get the extra teacher, and so they have the benefit of having class sizes of 14 for that year. But the problem is teachers don't routinely adjust their instruction for doing this, and it doesn't necessarily happen in the priority areas. So one of the big things that we work on folks with is thinking more flexibly about that, and it's one reason that having flexible use of resources is such an important complement to changing funding. And the last reason that funding differences happen is that districts sometimes just flat out subsidize having higher fixed costs in small schools. So these costs can end up being quite a lot, and it's one of the first things that we do when we go into a school system is really calculate how many small schools and how much does it cost. The second big reason that drives cost differences, and this one varies a lot across school systems because the distribution of teacher seniority varies a lot across school systems. But teacher compensation differences can drive big differences in funding levels, the real funding levels in systems. Typically, school systems charge schools for the average teacher salary, and they actually sometimes report spending based on average salary by school, not actual. And that is the predominant practice across the country. So in that case, regardless of what the teachers actually make, they are charged the same for every single teacher. So it looks like they're spending the same. But when you look at actual salaries, of course, schools will have very different distributions of staff. So you can see in this example on the left, a much more junior staff is spending $450,000 on teachers as compared to a much more senior staff. The challenge with this is that it's often the poorly performing schools that have the high concentrations of novice teachers and can't hang on to their teachers long enough to get to the experience levels. So this practice of reporting average salaries means that the schools don't have the extra dollars that they might have if you charge them actual salaries to invest in professional development or to invest in the supports that these teachers would need actually to keep them to staying in the school. It's actually a big distortion of true equity in a school system. As I said, Sometimes this is a big driver of difference in a district where there's wide variation in school performance. In other school districts, unfortunately, they all look pretty similar. So that's something you would have to look at. You should also know that the federal government has targeted this issue in particular, and that it's been a source of great lobbying effort, and it will be in the next round, hopefully, of reauthorization, that school systems will be required to report actual salaries, not average salaries, and to prove that they're not using Title I dollars to supplant actually paying teachers in that way. So hopefully now you get a sense of what we mean by equity and what's driving it. Let's talk a little bit about weighted student funding, because it's a big topic in the reform conversation, and it's sometimes viewed as the silver bullet for fixing equity. As I said in the beginning, we feel strongly that it's an important enabler to doing a lot of the things we need to do to redesign systems, but it certainly is not a silver bullet. And as leaders of these school systems, it's important to understand the other pieces that have to be part of the puzzle. So we use the term weighted student funding in this presentation. Other terms are student-based budgeting and fair student funding. These all typically mean the same thing when they're used, and the choice of wording sometimes has political ramifications, such as the case of New York City and Baltimore. In the case of New York City and Baltimore, very famous cases of weighted student funding, they accompanied the fair student funding with other components like increased accountability for principals and so on, and called that part of their overall reform effort. So let's get into the details of how weighted student funding would work. Under a weighted student funding system, districts would figure out how much to spend to serve students that have different needs. That's what we mean by the weight. So in this case, every student would get $5,000. That would be the base weight. So every student in the system would get that regardless of what their needs were. And then there would be an additional weight added to reflect additional learning needs. So in this case, we've said Mark comes from a family of poverty, and so he might get an additional 0.1 weight, and he also has some special education needs that require resource room services. So he gets another 0.5 weight, totaling 1.6 or $8,000. Maria, who's a high school student in this district, and she has English language learning needs. So she totals a 1.5 and gets $7,500. So in this version, Mark would get that dollar wherever he went. So he would take that $8,000 to any school that he went, and that would be a big move toward equity. Because as we saw earlier, Mark would actually get very different levels of resources if he was in that traditional district we showed on the fancy bar chart in the beginning. So then if we move to then how schools get their budgets, we've given Mark a weight, and then we generate the elementary school budget based on the number of kids who have those different weights. But that doesn't represent the total amount that the school gets. There are additional categorical funds, as well as funds that districts hold back and don't include in the funding formula for various reasons. So another way to look at this is the districts would allocate much of the general fund dollars through a weighted student funding formula. They would hold back a portion in what we call locked funds that districts lock for various reasons, like an art teacher, one art teacher per school, or some amount for library books, and so on. And the third area would be for categorical funds. There's a pretty lengthy process that we engage in with districts as we think about what things should be locked. And in fact, there are huge differences in the percent of funding that districts allocate through student-based budgeting, even when they say they do student-based budgeting. So we've seen districts that allocate 24% of their dollars through a formula like this, and other districts like Baltimore that allocate upwards of 75% of their resources through a formula like this. And when you get to a place where you're allocating that percent of funding, you really are having to change the way you organize your central office and how you're providing guidance to schools. One really important thing to understand about locking these funds, because it's easy to say, well, of course we should unlock everything, is that there are important reasons not to unlock all of the resources. For example, one important reason is for efficiency. So it could be that devolving all of the dollars for, let's say, maintenance services that go out on an uneven basis to schools would not be an efficient use of resources because schools can't organize to do that. And in cities where there are lots of service providers that could maybe do this at low cost, that might work. But in other places, the best way to lower costs is to keep it in-house. Another set of reasons are about compliance. How can you ensure compliance? And a lot of districts hold back special ed dollars for compliance reasons. And a third important set of reasons is around equitable access, and that's where the art teacher falls in. So especially in very low funded districts, it can be the case that it's hard for schools to maintain all of the services that the district and the school board have decided are part of are sort of a given right of being in a school, and so they choose to hold back certain positions that they want to be able to guarantee. So this idea of equitable access to certain kinds of programs and resources can sometimes conflict with equitable dollars if school sizes vary a lot and student populations vary a lot. So one important part of figuring out a weighted student funding system is figuring out what goes in the formula and what doesn't. Another big set of decisions has to do with deciding what to weight, how to weight the different student needs. And this chart, which I'm not going to go through, you can come back and take a look at it, describes the principles we use to decide what things to weight. What you should take away from this chart is that the weights that your district chooses may not be the same as the weights another district chooses. And that's because you may have, for example, if your school system is 60 or 70% English language learners, which actually is true in some Texas districts, weighting those students is actually sort of irrelevant because you might as well weight everyone that way. Or it takes so much money away from the other students that it creates a huge inequity the other way around. And so it really does matter your own district. We can say, however, that there are some typical weights that seem to be emerging around the different characteristics. And this chart just shows what things folks typically weight. We have a lot of resources that show how much they typically weight these things, and there's not much variation actually around some of it. So some districts give a flat amount to schools to start with. So let's say every school gets $200,000 to cover your principal and your clerk. And that was true in Hartford, Houston, New York City, San Francisco, and Seattle at the time we did this chart. Some districts have different weights for different grades, reflecting different service models that they have, different class sizes, or different priorities. Some actually give more weight to students that are high performing. Some give more weight to students that are low performing, under the rationale that they need more resources. Almost all districts gave weight to students who live in poverty. Harvard didn't. This would be an example of all the students that were in Hartford came in poverty, so they didn't. So there was no point to weighting the general funds in this way, and so on down the line. Other things that folks weight in the bottom category. Some districts have weights for concentration of poverty. So if you have more than 75% poverty students, you might get an additional weighting. This is very consistent with the research on how difficult it is to turn schools around and to improve student achievement with those levels of spend. But again, if you're in a district where most of the schools are 75% or more poverty, it's sort of an irrelevant weight. Other things that districts weight, like Houston, has still huge weights for magnet schools, get significantly more dollars just because they're magnet schools, for example. And New York City was one of the first districts to weight incoming academic proficiency. So They give schools more money when the student is coming in way behind, and schools keep that money throughout their stay in that school, giving the school theoretically an opportunity to catch up with those kids. Developing waste is difficult and really political, and the reason is because it's a zero-sum game. Giving a weight to one student means another student gets less resources. And so we described this by using a pie. And actually, one of the school boards that we worked with in Cincinnati, as they were having this discussion, she used a piece of paper and she'd stand up and she'd say, every time this would come up, she'd rip the paper and go, "We've only got one set of resources here. You just took off that much of it." So, and this just shows you that in this district, the district decides not to offer a grade weight. So this is the base weight. Special ed gets this 20 million, ELL gets 5 million. In this district, they decided to do a grade weight for the priority grades of K3 and 7 and 9. That costs an additional 15 million, which brings the base weight for all the rest of the students down to 4,500. When you run all these different scenarios and someone sees, oftentimes it happens that some schools get to a point because they have so few of these students that get additional weights where they can't operate in traditional ways on this amount of money, which begs a really important set of questions that we'll talk about later. They can't operate in traditional ways on this amount of money. And that's the piece where we get into what are the ways schools can actually organize to provide services in different ways, perhaps with fewer dollars if their students don't have as great needs. So to summarize, districts all over the country are thinking about implemented weighting student funding for 5 big reasons. The first is equity, and as we've seen, weighted student funding can go a long way to create equity when we talk about equity as the same dollars per pupil or similar dollars per pupil adjusted for need. It can't address the other elements of equity like which students and principals, which principals and teachers are in those schools, and equitable access to programs and so on, if the other characteristics like school size and so on aren't also part of the design. It can empower school principals to use resources in different ways, but only if there's deliberate effort to make the resources more flexible. Weighted student funding is just about how much schools get. It's not about how they use those resources or about how flexible they are. So there has to be another set of work that goes around making sure that schools actually can be free to use those resources in different ways. In many districts that we've worked in, the dollar funds are so low that when you combine them with all the mandates for how they have to staff schools, they literally don't have any money left over after they get their per pupil allocation. So it's sort of just this myth, that if you give the dollars on a per pupil basis, that suddenly there's all this flexibility. If in fact you haven't changed any of the district policies or the contracts that describe what staff need to be in there, and there's no money above that amount. The same holds for innovation. The fourth is accountability. The idea is if you put the money down as dollars, then schools would have control of their budget, and you could then hold principals accountable for using it well. Well, that works if principals have capacity to do this work, and as we said, they actually have the freedom to use it differently. And a big part of that freedom has to be about hiring the teachers that would work well in your school and that perform well, and also being able to manage teachers out if they aren't contributing well. And the last important reason for allocating dollars on a weighted student funding basis is that it makes it more transparent what schools are getting for which students and why. And this has been a very motivating thing in a number of the districts that we've worked in. Boston is a great example where they use weighted student funding really as an arrowhead into the whole question of equity, and the question is really they viewed it as a moral action that we need to fund the schools that need it most at higher levels, and we need to hold ourselves accountable for making sure that they have what they need. And it really changed the political conversation, because in Boston there were a set of schools that were just routinely more privileged than others, and this really enabled a very different conversation. As we've said, weighted student funding doesn't fix all the drivers of inequity by itself. It does address some school size issues, but some districts may have to do a lot of things to try to reduce the cost of small schools, or else they're going to have to be offering some kind of additional dollars to small schools that won't be able to do what they need to do on the new amount. It's interesting, Baltimore City actually used a weighted student funding system to create a set of schools that were not viable. And they were deliberately meant to do this in the sense that they wanted to say, if you can't keep, it was a choice district, and if you can't keep your enrollment up, then you will lose your school. And they actually very successfully, in a short period of time, closed a pretty large number of schools and moved 11% of their student body into higher performing schools using this process. But that process was combined with an accountability system, a very active facilities management system, and the ability to have kids attend to higher performing schools that were somewhere nearby. As we've said, it doesn't change teacher compensation differences. You could say that you could fix that by turning it into actual salaries, but the truth is, what we know now in most districts, salaries don't totally relate to teacher quality either. And that's one big complication to trying to use this as a way of measuring equity. In fact, in some districts, we have huge concentrations of very veteran teachers in the lowest performing schools, simply because that's the place where they end up after the teacher is no longer wanted by any of the other schools. They end up in these schools. So in that case, equity requires the measurement of teacher effectiveness, which can be a real complement to the funding equity measures. We can now begin to start looking at the distribution of highly effective teachers across schools. The last thing that is important to pay attention to is these ad hoc exceptions. If the district doesn't stop making one-off decisions above and beyond the weighted student funding formula, then they haven't changed a whole lot. So by now you're getting this message loud and clear that weighted student funding is very important, really an important metric for beginning this process, but that it needs to be coupled with other things to really do it. And I've highlighted a couple of these throughout, but the save money one is particularly important. A lot of folks think that if you go to weighted student funding, then you're putting all those dollars right down to the school, and you're going to, by definition, shrink the central office. Well, it should be obvious by now, as I've gone through this, that those decisions need to be made very deliberately. Devolve money out of the central office and put it into schools and give them the choice to use it. That's something that Baltimore did very deliberately at the same time that they chose things to lock and unlock. So if shrinking the central office or reducing spending is part of the goal, then it has to be a deliberate part of the effort. This was a very quick run through weighted student funding. It's a really complicated issue in terms of implementation. It's one where the design details matter hugely. Just like so many of the issues in education reform, same with choice. It's an enabling feature, but the design details matter hugely. We've got a lot of resources that we've created to support this kind of work, both around funding systems and most importantly around school design. When we say school design, we mean how are schools organizing their people, time and money. And what we've seen is that districts that really make headway with this also accompany student-based budgeting with lots of work around principal capacity to help support them in making really different sorts of changes, to provide models, and then really importantly to redesign the support they're getting to help them be strategic about their resource use and find the people that they need and find the new providers that they need to implement higher performing designs. And of course, that's what this is all about. And then finally, please go to our website and check out the other sources that we have. In particular, we've got a series of scenario tools that will support you in thinking about different ways of spending money and how much they would free up. And we will have very shortly we'll have online tools that would support school design where you could play around with different ways of organizing schedules, different ways of grouping students, and organizing teacher teams that would play out into different dollar amounts, which could support work on what level schools really need to be funded at and for which students. So I hope that by the time we've gotten to the end of this, you're feeling like this is something that you would be able to ask good questions about and that you have some good places to go to get some help with it. So throughout this presentation, I've described how student-based budgeting can be applied in a district context, but it's important to realize that this is also a strategy that many states are moving to. Rhode Island is an example of a state that's recently implemented student-based budgeting formula. California, if all goes well, will be implementing a very radical change for its state in which they'll be allocating dollars on a per pupil basis that used to be tied up in just an incredible number of fragmented funding sources on a weighted student basis. And the districts who are high poverty, highly needy districts tend to absolutely love this because of course it gives them more resources. Tends to be very political because, as we described the pie earlier in the presentation, it takes money away from folks who vote more in the state legislature. So it can be a very hard thing to actually enact at the state level, which is why more states don't do it. But many of the same principles hold true. I would like to conclude by really emphasizing the critical role that school leaders play in making effective use of resources and in turning any sort of reform of the budgeting process into something that improves student performance. We see this as the most frequently neglected piece of the funding reform effort. And too often, in fact, virtually every time we've done this, the capacity building for principals is around the mechanics of the new budgeting process. And the people who are charged with the building of principal capacity are the budget folks. And so just to give you an anecdote, I just did a training in a very large school district of the zone superintendents who were going to be responsible for doing this. And I was talking about the use of talent, time, and technology and scheduling and how teacher teams could happen and so on. And the person from the budgeting office came up to me at a break and said, well, I thought this was about budgeting. When are you going to talk about budgeting? And I said, budgets are a reflection of the way that you use people's time and money, and so principals actually don't necessarily need to know how to fill out the Excel spreadsheet that is the reflection of that budget. What they do need to know about is how they can take the resources they have and employ them in ways that make things better for students. And so if there's going to be a funding reform, it has to be in the context of all of the other challenges that principals are engaged with to improve student performance. And right now, in our urban schools in particular, we've got two big waves of things happening in addition to changing the budget. The first is Common Core implementation, which has huge implications for teacher recruitment, selection, and development and retention, and also just building the skills and finding time for them to do that, as well as the effort to do more effective teacher evaluation, which requires significant principal time and requires them to learn a whole lot new. So the districts that we know of that are having some success with the budget kinds of reform and with empowering principals to use resources more effectively are helping them integrate all three of these things as one. So helping them see how control of their resources will enable them to implement Common Core more effectively, will enable them to do teacher evaluation more effectively, and to give them more time and to engage more help in doing that. So that these things are perceived as part of one effort and not separate initiatives.